In today's video, we want to be discussing chassis paint or anything that you're not going to bodywork and go through that long process, but actually have good adhesion to where you're not gonna have all of these delamination problems later. We're also going to be discussing some of the techniques on spraying to make sure that you get good coverage over a very intricate part. So we're back on this 49 Willys. These are the very last parts that we have to paint, and we just have a light bar, license plate holder, and a tire carrier. When we're doing these, this is going to be the exact same process that we did on the chassis. So we want to talk about what products are we using, how are we getting the good adhesion that we're getting, and knowing that we're going to have a quality part when we're all done. When it comes to the prep of the bare metal, because these are chassis parts and they're not exterior sheet metal, I would say that the best thing is media blasting. We're using an 80 grit garnet, which is a little bit finer than what a lot of people are using for media blasting, but it gives you a very nice profile. Profile is that sand particle making the surface rough and textured, so that way the paint has a mechanical adhesion. You have mechanical adhesion and you have chemical adhesion. You guys have seen other videos in the past where we did our acid washing and understanding chemical adhesion. Well, we're going to talk about both today. We have mechanical adhesion through whether it be sandblasting or media blasting, as well as hand scuffing with a grit that you're going to have a tooth that the paint can adhere to. Understanding your TDS sheets. What is a TDS sheet? A TDS sheet is telling you exactly what that product is capable of doing. What temperatures, what grit, how long is your flash times in between coats, all of those details. So on this one, we have parts like, for example, the light bar, where we did a combination of sandblasting and hand scuffing because we couldn't fit it in our cabinet, being that these parts are the very last parts and the media blaster has already left. But when we were doing the chassis, we obviously cardboarded up the body so that way we could come back in and get the good adhesion from the profile of the media blast in all the nooks and crannies. Because if you're trying to hand sand some of these parts, you're never going to get really good adhesion down in those valleys and nooks and crannies around every little tab, where if you can blast in there with a media that's giving it a profile everywhere, you're getting the best mechanical adhesion from that point. Going back to the TDS, understanding what primer are you going to use, what product. You don't want to be using a primer that is not a DTM, a direct to metal primer. In this case, we are going to be using the ESU Delfleet product. It's the ESU 482. It is a black epoxy primer. Now, what's nice about the black epoxy is it's going to give us that corrosion resistance over the bare metal. It's going to stick into that mechanical adhesion from the sandblast or media blast, as well as a mechanical hand scuffing scratch, and then it's going to seal that up. Now, in the past, we've used 80 grit for a lot of our prep, but we're understanding mill thickness. We're only putting on this about 2 mils of epoxy primer, if that. We want to use a sandpaper that is fine enough that we're not going to see those scratches, because what our goal here is to have minimal work. It's better to use a fine media because you have a very fine finish that the epoxy will lay really nice over. Where if we hand scuff this with, say, 80 grit, you have this really deep scratch, and that epoxy is not thick enough to cover it. So if you did use 80 grit and you need to cover it, well, then you're gonna have to come back in with a, maybe it's VP 2050 that's a high build DTM primer, so you can then smooth and hand sand those out. For this, we're trying to take the path of least resistance and have something that I don't have to come back and hand sand. So using epoxy over the sandblasted surface and the hand scuffing is giving us the adhesion, and we're using a chemical adhesion from the flash time. We can wait 30 minutes with this product and then go right over the top of it without having to scuff it. A lot of people think that epoxy primers, because some of the old school epoxies are not sandable, A lot of the newer epoxies, read the TDS sheet. It will tell you what you can sand it with. But for this one, we're gonna let it flash for the 30 minutes after we're done with our 2 coats of epoxy. And at that point, we know we have good adhesion. We've let it flash. It has completely gassed off, and we're not gonna worry about anything that's delaminating. We're getting mechanical to the scratch, and we're getting a chemical adhesion into the epoxy from our single stage paint. Some of the other applications that this is really nice to use on would be trailers, door hinges, anything that is hard to get into that you can't scuff it thoroughly, then this is ideal. Obviously, we've done videos where we show like a firewall. Maybe your firewall is the factory one that has all those curves and bends in it, and it's not practical to mechanically strip all of that stuff. Maybe you just want to have the media blaster come in and get rid of all that paint and give you a really good adhesion in those areas. And if you're not going to bodywork a door hinge or a light bar, in this case, a boat trailer, whatever it may be, maybe you're just doing a chassis for your vehicle at home, then media blasting and or hand scuffing is optimal. The only reason I would say media blasting is so much more superior is because you can get in every nook and cranny and you're going to get that adhesion. Where if you go outside of the adhesion window, which is the top coat window, let's say you go beyond the 72 hours that that particular product allows, you then have to mechanically scuff it. And if that's the case, I already know I can't get into every little area and scuff it, so I'm not going to have as much adhesion as I would planning the spray, planning to blast and getting in the booth immediately. We just blasted these parts. Rust microscopically starts within 30 minutes, if not less, depending on your temperatures and your humidity. So even though you can't see it, does not mean that it's not happening. To follow up with some of the different pieces that we have here, this one we hand scuffed because it does not fit in our blast cabinet and it doesn't have as many intricate areas, so we were able to use 150 grit sandpaper to scuff all of this part. Well, in order to get all of the parts here at the right time, this started to show a little tiny bit of flash rusting. So because it's hand scuffed and not media blasted, we were able to go through and acid wash this part and remove any remnants of rust that may have microscopically started. So we get that chemical adhesion through that 150 grit scratch. I know that that epoxy will cover 150 grit scratches and not show up later with the paint. And then we chemically washed it to get adhesion from the conditioner in that acid washing process. We will put the video to how we acid wash in the description and in this video so you guys can understand what it takes to accurately go through an acid wash. A lot of guys will see some of the reactions with the acid washing chemicals and what products those are. If you use cold water versus hot water, just as a real quick example, this will have an orange hue to it versus using a warmer water, and it gives it a different look, almost like gasoline in water. It has that rainbowed look. It's not necessarily rust, it's a chemical reaction with the cold water. So check that video out if you guys want to know more about acid washing. I get a lot of questions on the other videos. If I have excessive pitting, can I acid wash it? Well, a pit from rust is almost identical to a media blasted surface, and that's going to trap the acids in that panel. We don't want to trap the acids. We want a mechanical scuff that we can easily rinse and neutralize. Because it's hand scuffed, we can do that. But if you have something that's excessively pitted, maybe it's a sheet metal exterior part, you may have to get a small pot blaster and just blast those pits, or put like a rust mort in there so you know it's completely neutralized. But these are the spectrum of things that you can do. But for a chassis part, number one, media blasted is definitely the best source for adhesion. I will not have to worry about any of these parts being taped off during the assembly for the thrash to get to SEMA this year, and they can unmask it and everything will stick just fine. Let's discuss spray technique, because A majority of the projects that we've had in the past, especially with some of these off-road vehicles and the intricacy of the chassis designs and pockets, you're limited to where you can get with a gravity feed gun. This is a Supernova 1.4 tip from Iwata. It is a gravity feed gun, meaning the gravity is what's flowing the fluid into the tip. But a lot of times when you're trying to get into certain areas, you're bumping your painted surface and it becomes problematic. Recently, for this particular project, we just invested in a DeVilbiss ProLite pressure pot. A pressure pot for this style gun has a hose coming down and an air line going down to a pot that is pressurizing the paint into the gun. And now you have the ability to tuck the hoses back against your arm so you can come into areas that you wouldn't typically be able to get into and not have a cup that's bumping into things. Understanding your fan. The horns on the gun are where the air pressure is coming out, creating a fan. And if we want to come through this part without having runs and sags, we need to go through it evenly. We want this to be an even, consistent paint job. Now, although I always say I like to treat all of the cars that I prime and that I spray as if it's like a candy, because you want to go through evenly and not have a dark area. So a candy, anywhere you go over more than the other areas, it's a darker area. It's thicker. If the paint is thicker and it's more likely to run like a thin epoxy versus like a high build that's got a lot of body to it, it's not going to run off the vehicle, then we need to put this on as even as possible. But we have all of these tabs and brackets that are in our way. So the plan of approach there is be methodical. A lot of guys will take the approach of standing back and they try to spray everything that they can see from this angle, and then they move to the other side and they spray everything that they can see from that angle. But when you have a complex chassis, as you're doing it with the cab in the way, these deep pockets, you want to be going through this methodically, making sure that you go through that one piece evenly and get even coverage. These horns creating that fan will pivot up and down. Take the time to make sure that you have the right temperature that you're spraying at, that things are not flashing too fast. You want to keep that wet edge for this paint. Now obviously during the TDS process, when they're testing these products, everything is around 70, 75 degrees. So if you can paint somewhere around that temperature, that's ideal. We don't always have an ideal situation. In here right now is probably 90 degrees in the middle of summer, and so epoxy is going to stay wetter longer. And if I know that, I've tested panels, then I'm going to put a lighter tack coat through this. It's a wet coat, but I don't want to hammer this complete coverage. I find that some of these epoxy primers, they're a little bit on the transparent side. So when you go through, if you can see right through the paint and still see bare metal, don't sit there and keep hammering it. You'll have sags and runs. And because epoxy takes longer to dry, you're going to be waiting a long time to even be able to come in there and sand that run out. And my thought there is, if you've waited long enough to sand the run out, now then you should probably go through and mechanically scuff a lot of those areas. The TDS sheet will tell you that you have roughly 72 hours to top coat this with paint without having to mechanically scuff it. I have trust issues when it comes to that, because we've had issues where things went more than a day and it didn't get hand scuffed. So now we just make sure, if we can't shoot it all within a very close timeline, I like to shoot it and within a couple hours be shooting the paint right on top of it to make sure that everything is curing together and really locking in. You don't want something that's completely cured, layered with no scratches and no chemical adhesion, and delaminating when you go to pull tape off later. So understanding the fan angle and how you're going to come in there and make sure that you get everything even, and make sure that you have a gun that you can fit in there. Maybe a pressure pot is not in your budget, then be thinking about the gun you're going to use. So in this case, I like my Supernova, so I'm going to spray all of these parts with the cup in the way. but I'm going to make sure that I am watching the cup as I move through this panel. I'm not watching the paint and not focusing on bumping something. I want to show you on a couple of these pieces, if you're new to this, how I would actually go through and paint this surface and not have a sag or a run. I'm going to be making sure that the horns of the gun and my fan are where I need them to be. If you pretend that this is a paintbrush, you want to be painting it on evenly every surface. So as you work the gun through, I'm not so much focusing necessarily where the paint is hitting, but I also have to think about the gun cup itself not coming in contact and hitting and leaving a mark in my wet paint as I work through. But I want to catch this surface 100% before I move forward and I get an area that gets missed and will start to rust later. So I'm going to focus on bringing the gun through, getting this side of the tab and the edges of the tab as I work through. I'm going to get everything that I can get from this side, and then I'm going to come to the other side and I am going to go back through with even gun settings, even technique, making sure that my fan, don't get lazy and try to tip the gun all the time. Sometimes it's as simple as turning the horns and then you have a nice consistent spray pattern, so that way the millage right here is not bulky. If I neglect to turn the horns and I forget and I go like this, all of that paint went right in one spot on such a small surface, you're going to get a run down this panel. But I will focus on all of the hard to get pockets and holes and make sure I get all of those surfaces first before I come through and make everything look nice and even. If you go through it very methodical on the first one, let that get a little tacky after 10 or 15 minutes before you come back in with a nice, good, even coverage coat. So that way all of this metal is sealed up. Now let's talk about the light bar, a little bit more complicated piece with a lot more angles and areas that you have to get into. Well, when it comes to gun setup and understanding what does your gun spray good at for that product, it's going to be different for everybody that sprays. My technique may not work for you, and I want you to understand how you practice gun setup and getting the product to do what you need it to do. If you're adjusting your needle for how much paint is coming out for that pressure, that TDS sheet that you're spraying on that product will tell you a ballpark air pressure to start at. Now me personally, I always find that those pressures are a little bit on the low side. It might tell you 25 PSI at the air cap. I like to shoot around 30, 35 PSI. And if you change the fan, you just took that fan that was a wide spray and you narrowed it to a bullet size. When you do that, now you have more pressure going in that one spot. So take a test panel, a scrap fender, and do a pass and set your gun up and jot it down. On this day, I used this product at this pressure, this many turns out on the needle, in or out, where was my fan? So I like to start the fan wide open, all the way out. That way I count in every time. How many turns in did I go on the fan for this product? And I go all the way closed on the needle because we want that no paint. And then we open it one turn and we do a pass and we check it. And we open another turn and we check it. That way we can start creating the consistencies that we want with how we spray. What the air pressure is. How far away are you from your panel? And as you get good with that, you can set those parameters every time and it's then repeatable. But when it comes to a pocket, I may want to narrow my fan so it's a bullet and I can hit a couple little areas way down in these pockets. By me focusing on making sure that all of the pockets get covered first, I don't have to worry about rust coming back to those areas. So I am going to focus on all of the inside pockets first, up inside of all these areas where I point it in there and I feather it in. If the gun setup is correct, I can almost use this like an airbrush, and I very little at a time, I forgot I had paint in this, very little at a time, I can feather in the paint. I can even dial back and just put it in there little bits at a time so you don't have that buildup on an edge where it starts running. Give yourself time. And when you come to the paint process, it's going to be the exact same thing. Making sure you get all of the tight areas first, and then going back through everything, making sure you coat that tube. Don't shoot the tube and all of the brackets. You want to shoot the tube in every angle, making sure that tube is completely covered 360 degrees. Then go to the bracket and make sure the bracket is covered completely. Everybody has a style. Figure out what style works and jot all of those settings down so you can do it over and over again. We've gotten done shooting the epoxy primer. It's been about 30 minutes according to the TDS sheet. 30 minutes is what we need to top coat. So we are getting chemical adhesion right now from this still being open, meaning it's not hardened and cured, and it's going to adhere to this flashed off epoxy. Epoxy, I want you guys to understand, because I hear people use the term sealer loosely, because technically we are sealing out the moisture from the bare metal right now. But can epoxy be used as a sealer before your base coat and clear coat? It absolutely can. You don't have to use a urethane sealer. There's pros and cons to it. The pro and con there is that if you're using, say, a urethane sealer, you might get a little bit more shrinkage. If you use an epoxy, if you have any burn throughs to the bare metal, this takes care of that as well. A urethane sealer is likely not going to adhere unless it specifies that it is a DTM, direct to metal, to adhere. So epoxy is a little bit more robust, but on the same token, I get a little bit more of a texture. Like, we're talking nitty gritty. This works great if you're gonna paint your tractor or your trailer or something along those lines. But just understand that the term sealer gets used loosely, but you can use epoxy for sealing up bare metal. You can use it for a sealer before paint. So that's the give and take. A couple other things. We already mixed up a Delfleet single stage paint. We chose single stage with this chassis because from doing the chassis of the truck, it took 7 hours to go from the front to the back with one coat. We had to do it all in epoxy first, just like this, and then we had to go back through with paint. So that was 14 hours straight of painting that chassis. Here, it's nice because we have single stage. We've eliminated having to go back through with a base and a clear. This is also nice because we custom mixed a single stage metallic color. This is like a charcoal color, gray, and it's actually mixed to flat. Well, the Delfleet mix ratio is you can actually change the sheen of that paint. So whether you want flat or semi-gloss or gloss, you could get a paint that has a different mix ratio. That's why we make sure that we get the exact same sheen. So we've painted the chassis a different day, and we're painting this now a week or two later. We went back to the scale and we made sure that this was a 6 to 1 to 1. Well, what does that mean if your cup only goes to 4 to 1? If you mix on a scale and you put the base color in, the actual single stage paint, and whatever that is in parts, you take that number and divide it by 6. That gives you a 6 to 1 to 1. So then we could go through and put our hardener and then our activator at that number to have an accurate mix every time. If you're not paying attention to that mix ratio and you're using a flat color or a semi-gloss, you're going to get a different sheen from one day to another or one batch to another. This is also nice to have the Luma Light, a gun light, because especially down here in these hard to get areas, we always have a sunlight on the fly. I leave this thing on all the time so I can see exactly if I have good coverage. We do have a discount code if you guys want it. It's Sylvester7. Check the description. We will have the link to buying this light. There's several different adapters for different guns, And if you're in your garage, it's really handy. Maybe you want to see up under the rockers or the lips of the fenders. This gives you the ability to do so. When we roll right through this paint, I'm going to go through, again, it's the same process. This is going to spray slightly different than the epoxy. It's going to be a runnier product than the epoxy, even though epoxy is typically a runnier primer. Practice with the paint you're going to use, or pick a paint that's close so you can go through a scrap fender and dial in those settings of exactly what you need. I'm going to set this gun up very similar to what I did with the Pro Light pressure pot, and I'm going to adjust it on the fly as I go through this in the beginning. Once I find what I like, I now know what that setting is for that gun, and there's no more guesswork. I'm going to go through this exactly like I did the epoxy, being methodical and trying not to get a heavy run. It is problematic if you have a single stage metallic. If you get a run, you cannot color sand and polish it. One, we have a flat color that we're using, so we already can't color sand and polish it. However, if you were doing this in a gloss and you had a run, the metallics will pull down in that run because it's not locked in like a base coat. And if you were to take that run out, you will still see the pattern of where the run was because of the collecting of the metallics in it. So there is a pro and a con there. I would say if you're going to pick a single stage metallic, you should have some practice under your belt before you do this, or take your time. We've gone around and done 2 coats of color over all of the parts for uniformity and making sure that we have coverage. This particular color is very easy to see going over the black epoxy, being that it's almost like a sandblasted looking color. It almost looks raw. But there's a couple things that we do. We always want to maintain a wet edge. So as I come through there and I dust in areas down in a pocket, say on the light bar, at the very end, I like to come back through all of the exterior things and maintain that wet edge and look. If you were to use a high metallic color and you just come in here last, a lot of times you'll see those stripes where the metallics don't look uniform as you go through it. So go over all of the main areas at the end to give you that uniform look and get all of the tight areas in the beginning. Another trick that you guys can do is turn off your lights and use a sunlight. You can use the Luma Light as you spray, and you can actually get a feel of how much transparency does the color that you spray have. If you use a sealer that is more for the color that you're going to be spraying, you're not going to have to use as much paint. So I already know that this dark gunmetal color covers really fast over black. Well, now we're keeping the mill thickness down and we're not having to have excessive coats. If I put this color over white, it would likely take more coats. Well, when you're putting all of these fittings together and this is a moving part, you're gonna risk having more things chip off because you have excessive millage and thickness over the whole part. But by turning the lights off, you're doing a couple things. One, you can see when the color is completely covered over your sealer or epoxy. The other thing is you're looking at the orientation of the metallics, the way that the metallics lay. How many times have you guys seen a car out in the sun and it looks splotchy or tiger striped? Turn your lights off, take a light, and go and check your panels. If it looks splotchy with a light, then it is definitely going to be splotchy after you clear coat, or in this case, a single stage, it's gonna maintain that. Well, how do you combat that? If you have splotchiness, it is a pressure setting and or a distance and movement. Sometimes you don't have enough coverage and you're seeing the base color coming through, and that gives it a splotchy look as well. But overall, the way that those droplets orientate over the panel is directly affected by your pressure and your speed. Because if your pressure is high, your itemization is going to be a very small droplet. But if you turn your pressure down a little bit, you're going to get a lot more of a uniform metallic spread over your panel. So you have to play with that for your paint. Single stage metallics is extremely hard to make look uniform. Being that this one's a flat color, it gives me a little bit more leeway versus a high gloss where those metallics still want to move until things start to kick and harden. So those are just a few tips on working through a technical area and how to have a really good quality lasting paint job. If you're doing this on a trailer, a boat trailer, a tractor, this is the perfect method to get that perfect adhesion. Hope you guys enjoyed the video and you got something out of it. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you guys on the next one.